Retired Australian Army Major General Mick is joining me now. General Ryan, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
It's great to be with you again, Natalie.
So Russian news is currently focused on two things. The fire at a Wildberries warehouse and the replacement of Ukraine's commander-in-chief and defense minister. Was General Syrsky bad for Russia, and could General Drapati prove even worse for them? That's the discussion in Russian news. As a retired general, what do you make of Ukraine's latest personal decisions, and how can such frequent leadership change, affect the course of the war?
Well, in most military organisations, senior leadership appointments change over every couple of years. So this is only the third commander-in-chief in 4.5 years of the war. And we should also remember that these senior generals, people like Syrsky, are working enormous hours. So they're under tremendous stress and fatigue. So giving them a break and moving someone else into that position isn't a bad idea every now and then. But I'm pretty convinced that any commander-in-chief that Ukraine puts in the seat will be a problem for Russia.
Will be a problem, okay. You write that Ukraine's previous command structure had effectively become two centers of power, pulling in different directions. How damaging is that kind of a conflict between the military leadership and the defense ministry in an active stage of war?
Well, it's damaging, but civilians and military in peacetime and war often have these kind of disagreements. There's always tension in civil-military relationships in democracies. But in Ukraine, I think that, historically, defence ministers have often been retired military in an era where a lot of these defence ministers have not been retired military. The general staff have sometimes had issues dealing with them. That's something that hopefully the new command team, the new acting minister and the new commander-in-chief will be able to work their way through.
And you described Drapati as a modern soldier-focused commander who supports innovation and accepts responsibility when things go wrong way. What exactly could change under him at the front and inside the Ukrainian military? Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, I guess we'll see what happens in the first week or two of his appointment, and we'll need to look at his initial appointments. But, under Drapati, he certainly has a mandate to firstly go and win the war on the ground for Ukraine. That's a very high priority, of course, but he also needs to reform and improve the mobilisation system. That has been a hot potato politically and in the military, and a whole range of issues around recruiting, conscription, demobilisation, support to veterans, these kind of things do need to be improved. He certainly has direction from President Zelensky about that, so I think that will be a very important priority as well. I think too that promotion of a new generation of leaders who have battlefield experience, perhaps less older soldiers, will be part of what happens with General Drapati as well. And finally, he will want to be, building and sustaining relationships with senior military officers in the United States and Europe where he hasn't already done so, because that will be crucial for Ukraine, but also for the transfer of lessons back into Western organisations who support Ukraine.
General Ryan, don't you feel cautious that this command reshuffle creates a period of uncertainty that Russia may try to exploit? How dangerous is this kind of a transition process for Ukraine right now?
It can be, but I don't see any evidence that soldiers on the front line or brigade or corps commanders are sitting there doing nothing and waiting for orders. They're just getting on with the vital job of defending Ukraine's people and its territory and its interests. So they're not waiting for new direction. They're just getting on with the business of the day, which is the operations to defend Ukraine, or in the case of others, the operations to attack Russian wildberries depots or oil refineries.
Yes, you're right. Institute for the Study of War says The Russian Defense Ministry is feeding Putin widely exaggerated figures about battlefield gains. And it claims that Russia seized more than 2,200 square kilometers this year, while Institute for the Study of War has confirmed a net gain of only around 81. Is Putin now making strategic decisions based on the false picture created by his own generals, or he's not into that? He's not involved that much?
Well, I think he's certainly getting a range of different information feeds from military and intelligence sources, and probably from foreign intelligence sources, probably from China and Iran and North Korea as well. But that's just one of the inputs he uses for his strategic decision making. Another one is the state of the Russian treasury and budget. That's extraordinarily important. And a third very important driver for Putin is his own personal safety and the survival of his regime. So whilst what's going on in Ukraine is a very important part of Putin's calculus, the most important thing for him, as it is with all dictators, is the preservation of his personal safety and the preservation of his regime.
You know, General Ryan, you mentioned all these attacks and wild berries and so on and etc. And I realized by watching and listening the thing that I hate to do, Russian propaganda, and how Russians are screaming and complaining of all of it. They don't have this logical chain in their brain or logical connection why Ukraine is doing that. In their heads, we're now attacking them, So basically, I stopped believing that they will go ever on a protest. It's just my thought. Well, they will never do that. Not massively, not even like hundreds of people. No, but I still have the hope that Russia will collapse. When we are hearing that the generals are feeding the dictator with the false gains on the battlefield, maybe that's also gonna be a plus to Ukraine. So altogether will bring the collapse of a Russian empire. That's what I think.
Well, we'll see. General Zaluzhny in a recent piece said, the trajectory of the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment is very positive, but he also cautioned against assuming that Russia had already lost, because it hasn't. Ukraine and its supporters have to do everything possible in the military, economic, information, diplomatic realms to guarantee that Russia loses their war, and that will include supporting people inside Russia who might wish to protest. I think it's, as you've said, unlikely Russians will protest against the war. We may see protests for the war and against Ukraine supported by Vladimir Putin. But more than ever now, the Russian people are starting to see the price of this war, which has been kept from them for so long. It is now impossible to hide that price from them.
General Ryan, you just said a brilliant quote that the only protest we can see that they will go supporting the war and supporting the dictator Putin. Wow. So quite opposite of what we were expecting, like in 2022 at least. I was reading that Russian soldiers are now openly complaining that fuel supplies to the front have been cut, with some vehicles limited to just 20 liters a day. On the Zaporizhia front, troops say they are walking kilometers. I was reading like 11 kilometers to deliver food and water. So what is your assessment of Ukrainian successful strikes like that are bringing the picture that I'm describing right now?
Well, for some time now, for some years almost, around 5 to 10 kilometres from the zero line has been an area where it's been very dangerous for vehicles to go into. But the mid-range strike campaign over the last 6 to 12 months, executed by Ukrainian armed forces, has been striking much deeper. And the fact that there are these shortages of fuel, of food, we've seen other reports, shortages of water and ammunition, is evidence that this mid-range strike, this interdiction campaign reaching out to about 150 kilometres behind Russian front line, is starting to work. It's starting to hurt the Russians, and it will be very important to continue this if Ukraine is to eventually undertake offensive operations.
Okay. At the same time, the Kremlin is reportedly preparing the legal and security infrastructure for another for mobilization, including recruiting people with criminal records and preparing Rosgvardia for possible unrest. My question is not more about mobilization, but what it tells us about the manpower, current manpower on the front line.
Yeah, it tells us that Putin is desperate and that his number one priority is not Russia and not the Russian people. It's his personal preservation and that of those around him in his regime. I mean, Putin has already emptied out a lot of Russia's jails over the last 4.5 years. It's hardly new that he's going to recruit and employ criminals in the army. At the end of the day, his army is a large criminal endeavour. They act like criminals. They're rapists, they're looters, they're murderers. So whether he uses hardened criminals from jails or people off the streets in Russia, he is using a criminal enterprise to undertake a criminal and illegal invasion of Ukraine to preserve himself.
Do you know who is Laura Loomer, the blogger, the MAGA blogger?
I know the name. I don't personally follow her, but I know that she's been visiting Ukraine this week.
She is.
She's even had a visit with President Zelensky.
Yes.
And appears to now be a supporter of Ukraine. That's a good thing.
That's a good thing, and that's a serious shift in the MAGA movement. Well, a lot of them are pro-Russian, and her audience is still predominantly pro-Russian. But still, I think that's just a good sign and moment for people like her, having millions of people listening or reading her, to understand that if she was wrong, then probably they were also. I think that's a good thing for Ukraine. I'm just reading the Zelensky impression of her, so that's interesting. But my question, the next one, I was reading that The Economist is saying that Russia is now passing on to China lessons from its war against Ukraine, including drone warfare, electronic warfare, urban combat, and even the data on how American systems such as HIMARS perform in battle. How much more dangerous does this make China in a potential war over Taiwan?
Well, I don't think this is news. This has been going on for years now. Russia, China, Iran and North Korea have been exchanging lessons and data and technical information and information on different strategies for literally years, almost since the start of this war. But it does mean that the North Koreans can improve their effectiveness against the Republic of Korea armed forces to the south. It does mean the Chinese will improve their weapons that they might bring to bear against their neighbours in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, the Philippines, even Australia. So we've seen this learning and adaptation block operate between the authoritarians for some years now, but they are getting closer. And we've seen recently that Russia and China appear to be helping Iran in its war against the United States of America and Israel. It's just hard to believe that anyone in the United States could support Russia, given what it's doing, not just in Ukraine, but against American service personnel in Iran.
Yeah. Also, I'm reading that Reuters reports that U.S. intelligence is investigating whether Russia helped Iran target CIA facilities in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, possibly by providing targeting data or advanced drone technology. Well, if that confirmed, and I think it will, that means that Russia is, directly helping its strikes, helping Iran it strikes sensitive American targets.
Yeah, I think there's little doubt that it's been doing that it's been providing targeting intelligence, and Putin probably sees this as an exchange for the United States providing targeting intelligence to Ukraine to hit Russia. I don't think, however, that people should see that as an equivalent thing. What Russia's doing is illegal in Ukraine and helping another awful dictatorship in Iran. The United States and what it's doing in Ukraine is not that.
Right. And also, the Financial Times is saying that, argues that this is maybe the right moment for negotiations and that Europe should play a much stronger role in that process. Do you genuinely see an opening for talks now, and how much influence can Europe really have when Russia repeatedly makes clear that it does not see European states as serious negotiating partners?
Well, I think every day is a good day for Russia to begin negotiations for its full withdrawal from all of occupied Ukraine. But unfortunately, Putin doesn't see it that way. I think he's still searching for some kind of victory to sell to the Russian people. He has not been able to find one. He is not going to find one in Ukraine. And what makes him dangerous is he might look elsewhere to find some kind of minor victory against a smaller country, for example, in the Baltics, to justify the expense and the massive loss of lives over the last 5 years.
My final one, the European Union finally agreed 21st sanction package after long discussions and blocking and the problems that some countries were not happy with that. Well, that we know. Do you think that West is still imposing enough economic pain to change Moscow's military calculations?
I think it's doing what it can, and we need to keep putting on different sanctions because Russia finds ways around sanctions packages. It doesn't mean it evades them completely, but it does find some ways to evade them. So every now and then we need to change things up, put different sanctions on, and force the Russians to respond again, impose more hurt on them before they can find ways around the new sanctions packages. So I'm a supporter of sanctions, but sanctions don't win war. People fighting on the battlefield win wars, and that's where we really need to help Ukraine.
General Ryan, thank you so much for talking about everything important right now and urgent, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Always a pleasure.